Good morning again, and again, welcome to Selkirk Baptist Church. As I said, today is the Pay a Compliment Day. Now, the history of the Pay a Compliment Day, it was created by Adrian Coopersmith, and that took place on February the 6th, 1995. Adrian was riding the bus back home and she saw a person trying to run after the bus with the expectation that the bus would stop, although the person was not at a bus stop. It was a cold February day, and the bus driver, out of compassion, stopped the bus. It's bus driver's act of stopping the bus that letting the guests get on the bus that moved Coopersmith. When she got off the bus, she gave her praise to the driver. She had been impressed by his actions, and from that she created Pay a Compliment Day. So if you want to observe Pay a Compliment Day, find somebody and pay them a compliment, a very sincere compliment. Nothing cheers up a person more than hearing that somebody appreciates who they are and what they've done. So give a sincere, warm compliment. It builds each other up. It is about seeing the good in each other, demonstrating love and kindness. That's what the day requires. Now, what does God require? Well, in life, we always want to know what's required of us. When we go for a job, we look at the job description to see if we're qualified, to make sure that we're able to do the tasks that are expected of us. As students, one of the favorite questions I love hearing was when a student would say, professor or teacher, is that going to be on the exam? In other words, they wanted to know whether they really had to pay attention. What are your expectations? What is God's expectations? We hear this passage from Micah that begins, stand up and plead my case before the mountains. And hear the Lord's accusations. For the Lord has a cause against his people. And then he goes on to say, my people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. The first verse actually in the whole book of Micah tells us that the word of God, or Yahweh, came to Micah in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. This took place in the 8th century BC. Well, the prophet Micah was a prophet for the southern kingdom. And at this time, Assyria was looming at the door. The southern kingdom's sins were really hidden behind religious observances and rituals. On the surface, everything looked wonderful, very orthodox on the outside, but Micah knew their hearts were far from God. He saw past their adherences to the external things of the law and addressed the root of their sins, that is, their heart. Now, Assyria at the time was the ruling superpower. It was located in Mesopotamia. It was east and north of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. And the prophet Micah carries out his work in this turbulent time. See, Micah lived outside of the government centers of power in his nation, and he had a strong concern for the people that God did, the lowly, the less fortunate of society, the lame, the outcasts, the afflicted. And nevertheless, in the midst of all the troubles that are going on, with the potential of going into exile, Micah preaches the word. Now, he also foretells of a time of faithfulness and peace, a promise of restoration after the exile. The opening verses in this passage almost sound like the language of a courtroom, with a prosecutor making his case. But that is the language of our day. We need to see this through the eyes of the prophet Micah and the people of the 8th century BC. This is, in fact, the language of covenant and relationship, and a relationship that needs attention. The prophet begins by quoting God here. There's an issue, and God is asking, what is the issue? What is the issue that people have with him? Because it's not God that's breaking the covenant. It is the people of the kingdom. The listener is asked to enter into this dialogue as a witness of what has happened between God and Israel. The language is very emotional and agonizing over the situation. And God says, make your case. In other words, let's put the issues on the table. And he says, answer me. See, there's a willingness here for God to engage in dialogue with his people. God interacts with his people about their concerns. And then God goes on to talk about bringing them out of Egypt, about sending Moses, Aaron, Miriam, and then the issues with Balak, the king of Moab, and all of these situations. So what God here is doing is providing a little bit of a history for the readers, reminding them of all that he has done for them throughout the years. They should be grateful for God's saving acts. Their hearts are far from God. He reminds them of the Exodus from slavery in Egypt to the promised land. He mentions leaders such as Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And it's interesting that Miriam is included in this list. This is a woman. This is a woman whose name is recorded in a man's world. A world dominated by men, where women were often considered property. Her inclusion here is a striking reminder that God doesn't have the values of the world in which we live. And then he goes on to talk about the deliverance from the Moabites. And then he says, then it is an answer of the people. With what shall I come before the Lord? Do I bow down and exalt God with burnt offerings, calves of a year old, maybe 1,000 or 10,000 rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Do I offer my firstborn for the sin of my body? And it's almost this sarcasm that, God, whatever we give you, it's just not enough. But given what God has done, the people ask what God is expecting of them. What worship practices are in order? What will please you, O God? He wanted to say, how shall I come before Yahweh? Central question here for the people is, what pleases God? The first proposal is that the worshipers bring burnt offerings. The second is escalated from the first. And then it ends with, should I offer my firstborn? What should I come before the Lord? The question is really asked out of a sense of bitterness and resentment for the situation that is around them. They know that Assyria is knocking on the door. In other words, God, you ask too much. Nothing's going to satisfy you. You're being unreasonable. And the question really assumes that somehow God is the problem. The answer in 6:8 calls the questions of 6 and 7 into question. The basic issue at stake is our relationship with God. And it's not the nature of worship. It's the nature of our hearts. He's shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require you to do? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. He's showing you. In other words, you act as if it's some great mystery as to what God requires of you. It's no mystery at all. It's actually quite simple. You put it in terms of some sort of official worship, and God puts it in terms of relationship. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. What should I require of you? Simply 3 things. Do justly, act in just and fair ways towards others. Treat them as you would wish you would be treated. Love mercy. Don't just show mercy, but love it. Give others the same measure of mercy that you've received from me. Remember, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And that should lead us to be humble people, which is the 3rd requirement. Walk humbly with your God. Walk humbly when you are spiritually strong. Being humble is not being weak. Walk humbly in all your motives. Walk humbly as you study the Word of God. Walk humbly under the trials that you face. Walk humbly with your fellow human beings. What does God require or expect of you? It's an important question in the midst of injustice and superficial worship. It's a question we need to constantly ask ourselves. What does God require of me? You see, God is inviting the people into a real relationship. He's inviting us into a real relationship. God doesn't want worship that's superficial. It has to be based on justice and love and mercy and humility. You know, it's interesting in the church, we often argue about the styles of worship, the new hymns versus the old hymns, contemporary worship versus traditional, liturgical worship versus less liturgical worship. God doesn't want lip service. If you're arguing about the types of worship, you're arguing about the wrong things. He doesn't want lip service, he wants heart service. His verse is one of the best summaries of the law in the Old Testament. Are we justice warriors for everybody? Sometimes we've left some people out. Israel forgot the most vulnerable. They were often reminded to take care of the widows, the orphans, the strangers, the people that society had forgotten about. Who are the vulnerable in our society? And do we even care? Are we a people who love mercy? Or are our hearts hardened? Are we a people who come to God with our answers, or do we humbly come with our questions? Does our worship mock the faith we declare? People ask about worship and sacrifices, and Micah says, no, I'm taking this in a different direction. God does not want hollow worship. He wants worship of the heart. It's about attitudes that come from the deepest part of a person's life, from our heart, and manifest themselves in positive actions towards God and fellow humans. This should not be radical stuff for the people of God. But sadly, it is. And it breaks God's heart. It's the best summary of practical faith. You want to please God? It starts with your actions based on a changed heart. If you want to be right with God, then do justice, love mercy, embrace humility. You want to be right with God? It does not start with worship or sacrifice. It starts with a heart change. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. What is your job description as a child of God? Or what is your final exam? He shows you what is good.